A couple of things before we do. First, there is going to go up a link on the web page. It'll probably be this evening. I hope to get it up over the weekend. But it's going to concern the optimal foraging stuff. So it's video from the same group that put together the behavior module that you went through. There's another module concerning giving up densities. So I'd like you to watch that video. The second thing that's going to go up, so links for GUD video. Then there's another one for the behavior, and that's an assessment. And that will, doing that as part of your grade. The third thing that I need from people are your data sheets. Okay? So you filled out X number of data sheets, and we need those. And the reason we need those is because your data then becomes part of this much larger database. And you will get grades for turning in your data sheets. There were a couple of people that weren't able to complete, for whatever reason, their behavioral assessments. A couple of students are, because of COVID restrictions and whatnot, aren't able to do that. So if you're one of those people, let me know, and I will provide you with plenty of data that comes from that database, and that database spans the country, you know, for all sorts of different species. There will be lots of data for other gray squirrels as well. Okay? The fourth thing, going through, if you've gone to the web page since last night at some point, there's a button now for the updated grades spreadsheet. Click the button and you'll see it's for both sections combined. And the one thing that you notice is I think there are only one or two people that have turned in the Markov analysis. Okay, so please make sure you do that. On the web page is this link to an Excel file that does all of the Markov analysis for you. All you have to do is put in your sequence data, right? And once you've put in your sequence data, it does all the computations necessary for you. And then it gives you, at the very end, it gives you the steady state vector. And then all you're going to do is compare the steady state vector with what you observed, right? And you'll see that they're different. All right, so there's that analysis. We had talked some time about doing that kind of Markovian analysis, so I'd like you to do that. All right, what else? The next thing we need to talk about doing some sort of assessment. We have this week and next week, and then Monday of the subsequent week. So after today, right, we have 2 more lecture meetings. You guys would meet not next week, but then the subsequent week before we go out on spring break. Thanksgiving break, and then we never come back. Well, I hope we come back, but not this semester. How would you guys like to do this? Because you're the only ones here, you're the ones that get to decide. How do you want to do this assessment? We can do one more exam just like the previous one. We could do that before we go to fall break. And then we would have a final exam, or we could just forget about this one and then do a final exam. What's your preference? I don't care one way or the other. Yes, no, unsure.
Let's do an open note final.
Open, just the final.
Just the final.
Just the final?
I'm good with whatever.
Okay, you're this way, that way, you don't care?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine with just the final, but either way, it's really fine with me.
Just the final sign.
Okay, so the final then will be set up just like the previous midterm was. So it'll be via job forms. Oh, and that's another point. You can go to the web page, and there you can click on another button. And it'll open up an Excel file, which is a CSV file. And unfortunately, in CSV files, you can't copy all the color codes for what was right and what was wrong. But you'll see, look at your code, and you can scroll across and see the answers that you gave. The very bottom row is the correct answer, okay? And the very top row are the questions, okay? So you can scroll across that and see exactly. And then on the far right column is your percentage, okay?
Would it be possible to have a little bit longer to take the next test? So that it would
Yeah, how much time did we have to do this one?
20 minutes, I believe.
It was 20 minutes? Yeah, how much time do you need? You're the ones that are here now, so you get to decide. 30 minutes?
I thought I said 30 would be enough, because it was the same amount of questions.
Yeah, so how many questions were there? I think there were, was there 40 or 50? It was probably 40 questions, I think. So 20 minutes, that would have been 30 seconds per question. Okay, so we can, we'll do 30 minutes for, we'll do 45 seconds per question or 50 seconds per question or something like that. So then you'll have more time. Okay? All right. Very good.
Do you want me to go ahead and turn in my data sheets?
Do you have them all? If you've got them now,
I have my share, but I don't have my others.
Do you have
You guys
all the-
have.
all the data?
What's on here? I have mine from Martha.
okay, let's see if we have some. Make sure your name is on there so that you get the credit. If you're just turning in your half of them,
Okay.
turn them in with just your name on it, and then it's up to your partner to do the other half. Let's see if we have paper clips around here.
I have my name on the observer section, his name on the partner.
Okay.
Is that okay? Would that work?
Yeah, just as long as your name is on there, that's fine.
Okay.
We don't have any paper clips, so I'll just do them with 9 God, that's so neat. That's so awesome.
And I was in a group of 3, so I only did 10.
That's fine, as long as your name is on there, and it's just your name on the, okay, very good.
I have mine on observer. You want me to write the difference for you?
Yeah,
Okay.
just write your name just across there, so I
do
know.
that too, because I also have a friend's name on it. so-
Justice, right?
Yeah.
You want me to write them all of them or just one?
No, just the first one is fine.
Okay.
Awesome. Alrighty, let's,
If some of our data sheets are with someone who's like out of class right now, how do you want us to?
because they're on COVID lockdown,
Yeah,
do you have email contact with them?
yeah, we can do that.
Just,
Just want to like scan them and
yeah, that would be fine. That would be fine. Okay, there are two things that I want to do today. I want to talk just a little bit more about predation. And then I want to talk about sort of we're not really switching gears, but I want to talk about something that's referred to as island biogeography. Before we do that, just sort of a general comment, I suppose. About what's been transpiring over the last a couple of weeks with the presidential election and all of that sort of stuff. I know that, you know, at your age, it's hard to keep this stuff put it in context because you have no point of reference really. I mean, you're young enough that you've only gone through been aware of a couple of presidential elections. But boy, this one is momentous. This is a huge, well, 4 years ago was a huge shift in the American political landscape, and this one is equally significant. And on the one hand, it's exciting, and on the other hand, it's really scary. It is surprising to me that it even, you know, that the election was as close as it was. I find it unimaginable. I have lots of friends that are in both parties and that feel very strongly about both candidates. And, you know, with my political views, it's hard for me to understand the other side, and I'm sure that's for the other side. It's hard for them to understand my point of view. But I think I think it's important, right, number one, to keep an open mind, and number two, you have to be cognizant, you have to be aware of what's going on in the world around you, right? And things like presidential elections are profoundly important. Just a couple of days ago, President Trump, much to my dismay, lifted all restrictions or lifted the protected status for the gray wolf, which to me is heartbreaking because I love wolves. I think wolves are just the absolute most amazing. I love dogs anyway. I love all kinds of canids, but wolves are just, to me, just absolutely glorious. And that saddens me. And the logic used to lift those restrictions is primarily because of the ranching industry in Wyoming, where ranchers are concerned about losing cattle and sheep to the wolves. In spite of the fact that the federal government pays a rancher for any loss of livestock, and they pay them much more generously than they would ever get by taking that animal to market. So you realize right away it's not an economic principle or it's not an economic decision. It's strictly, it was a political decision. And that breaks my heart. Okay, so, but these sorts of elections are consequential, and on the one hand, for you, it's pretty exciting because you get to see, you know, you're at this sort of inflection point in America where, you know, America could go this way or it could go that way, and we've had those sorts of episodes before, right? That was certainly the case when Richard Nixon was reelected, and that was certainly, you know, the case when FDR was elected, right? And the interesting parallel today with that election that happened with FDR was that in that transition period, I guess it was Hoover, right? In that transition period between his presidency and FDR's presidency, he refused to do anything. And as a consequence of his refusal to declare a bank holiday or anything of that sort, the economy just went into this absolute tailspin, and there was just total collapse, so that when FDR came into office, it was a significant mess. And I'm a little bit concerned today about what's going to happen, how seriously the current president is going to exercise his duties. And you hope that he does, right? You hope that he does the right thing. And you hope that there's not a lot of revenge sort of actions taken or, you know, vindictiveness that's displayed. But it is one of those inflection points, and, you know, everything that happens in your life from this point out, you can probably trace back to this point. In 20 years, you'll be looking back at the political landscape and asking yourself, what if this had happened instead of that? You know, so that's where we are. All right. So now back to stuff that's more easily comprehensible. And one positive thing, I suppose there are many positive things, but if you followed the news this morning, Biden and Harris announced The first act that they took as president and vice president-elect was they announced a coronavirus task force. And they are putting together recommendations on use of masks, on testing, on contact tracing, and all of that. And they're pretty hardcore. And the good news is that they have a team, and I forgot how many people are on the team, but it's almost 24 scientists. And these are people from the CDC and people from the FDA and so on, and from these major, from Johns Hopkins and so on. To advise them on what needs to happen, both in terms of controlling this pandemic, and then also convincing people of the importance of mask wearing and social distancing and all of that, and putting things into place to, ease the economic burden, because this is an incredible drag on the economy. So that's good news, right? The fact that they're going to rely on the scientists instead of just gut responses or something along those lines. So yay for science. All right, let's go. What I want to do is this. We had talked about these functional responses. We've been talking about predators, and we had talked about numerical responses and functional responses. And as you'll recall, a numerical response was as the predator consumed more prey, it resulted in more predators, right? And we went with that idea, and from there we went and started talking about predator-prey interactions, and we did this nice little modeling exercise where we produced a stable limit cycle. What I want to do now is talk for just a moment about the other kind of response. So that was a numerical response. Let's talk about a functional response. And it turns out there are 3 kinds of functional responses. And those responses look at the relationship between prey density and number of prey eaten. Okay? And the first kind of functional response is referred to as a type 1 functional response. And that is, as the number of prey increases, then the number of prey eaten increases, and it's a linear relationship. Now, the slope of that regression line doesn't have to be 1, okay, it could be whatever, but it is linear. There are 2 other kinds of functional responses referred to as type 2 and type 3 functional responses. A type 2 functional response is one in which, as the prey density increases, the number of prey eaten increases as well, but it asymptotes out. So it increases not linearly, but curvilinearly, and it asymptotes out. And you ask yourself, why would that happen? Why would it become asymptotic? And the most logical explanation is that, well, at some point the predator becomes satiated. So the wolf can only eat so many of the rancher's sheep. And at some point the wolf is gorged, and no matter how many sheep there are out there, he can't eat anymore. Okay, so at some point there's satiation and you just can't do it anymore. So that would result in a type 2 functional response. The most interesting kind of functional response is a type 3 functional response. And that's where it follows this pattern, and you've seen that pattern before. That's a sort of logistic pattern, right? We saw it in the logistic population growth. Now it's a nice logistic curve where it starts off sort of slow and then increases and then asymptotes out. Well, this part is easy to explain again because that's just predator satiation. You're full. No matter how many pieces of chicken there are in the all-you-can-eat buffet, once you're stuffed, and you can't take another one. Okay? But what explains this part of it down here, right? So this type 3 functional response is the one that's most interesting. What is it that would explain that kind of behavior? In other words, initially, when there is low prey density, the predator isn't getting very many. What might drive that? What do you think? Well, we had sort of alluded to that, I think. I don't know if that was with your section in lecture or the other class in lecture. But we alluded to the idea that there's this, you have to have a search image. For example, you're out in the field with an ornithologist, you know, a birder friend. All they're doing is looking up into the trees or looking into the bushes. If you're out with one of your herpetologist buddies, all they're doing is they're walking around looking at the ground. They have different search images. They're searching for different things. Maybe you've played games, you know, as a kid, or maybe if you think back to when you were a little kid, you went on Easter egg hunts, right? And this is the first time you've ever done it, and you're not really sure what this is all about. And all these little kids are scrambling out looking for Easter eggs. And the first kid, just by chance, sees one, sees the colors, sees the kind of place where it's hidden, and from that point on gets better and better and better at finding the Easter eggs. Okay? So experience matters because the kid has developed the search image. So that might be one of the things that explains what's going on here. At low prey densities, the predator has not yet figured out the appropriate search image, does not yet know exactly what it's looking for. Once it finds it, it recognizes the visual cues, the acoustic cues, the olfactory cues, and then is able to become much more efficient at taking the prey. The reason these things are important is because it's that type 3 functional response which is the most interesting. That's the one which has the potential to regulate prey populations. And that has implications for these stable limit cycles and how predation works. So let's go now. We did this stable limit cycle right here. Here is the prey isocline. That prey isocline under a type 3 functional response is no longer going to be linear. So this prey isocline assumes that we have a type 1 functional response. If instead we have a type 3 functional response, that prey isocline is going to be a curve. Okay? That prey isocline is going to be a curve, and the predator isocline curves a little bit as well. Under this circumstance, you're going to get this stable limit cycle, but the stable limit cycle is going to be tighter than it was before. Okay? But now, I mean, so far so good, nothing has really changed. But this is assuming, right, that the predator isocline intersects the prey isocline at the apex of the prey isocline. And that is unlikely to happen in nature. And in fact, here's sort of an interesting scenario. If the predator isocline is over on this side, okay, so if the predator isocline is shifted over to areas of low prey population density, notice what happens to the stable limit cycle. Instead of cycling in, it cycles out of control, and then it cycles through extinction. Okay? So if the predator isocline is shifted over to low prey densities, the system collapses. In other words, if the predator is too good, if the predator develops the appropriate search image too fast, if the predator is too good at exploiting the prey, the system goes to extinction. On the other hand, if the predator isocline is shifted over towards high prey densities, you get the opposite, because now you cycle and you cycle in towards the equilibrium point. So at this point, you don't even have stable limit cycles, it cycles into the equilibrium point. So if the predator takes a long time to develop the search image, doesn't really start to hit the prey until the prey densities are high, right? In other words, it's not that good of a predator, then the system persists. So what's going to drive the system over to this side? Well, any time where the prey has some sort of means of escaping detection or escaping predation. So if the prey has really good hearing or a really good sense of smell or is able to jump really quick to get away from the predator, or has a refugium, a place where it can hide from the predator, anything like that is going to cause the system to become stable. So years ago, and this is always the way it works, years ago there was this guy named Michael Rosensweight. Michael Rosensweight was at the University of New Mexico, which is, he left right before I got there. And he was an interesting fellow. He was an ecologist, but he was also really good at math. And he developed all of these really cool little models for trying to understand why animals should be active when they are, and predator-prey interactions and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, all of this kind of stuff that we're looking at right here is the kind of stuff that the math students do in their junior level, modeling classes and so on. It's cool, it's fun, and all of that, and it's pretty easy. But what Rosensweight did was he looked at all of these data from the ocean. And in the ocean, there are these wonderful systems where you have zooplankton and phytoplankton. And the zooplankton are the predators on the phytoplankton, right? So you have this perfect, it's easy to get huge amounts of data. And what Rosensweight did was he went out there and he figured out where the isoclines were for the prey and where the isocline was for the predator. And the system did not go to extinction. And he goes, well, that's sort of screwy. That's weird. That's not at all what we expected. So then the question is, why was the system different? Okay? So the predator is hammering the prey, even at low prey densities, and yet the system was stable. It had this sort of odd behavior, but it was stable. And the fact that it didn't work, the fact that it didn't fit, led to these sort of questions about why, what's going on, that helped us understand a little bit better the dynamics of predator-prey interactions. And it turns out, it's a pretty interesting story. Phytoplankton and zooplankton in the ocean are at the top. Okay? Well, for phytoplankton, sure, that's because that's where the light is. You don't have to go very far below the surface before there's no longer any light. It's dark. And when under those circumstances, when it's dark, there is no photosynthesis. Okay? So the phytoplankton are up at the surface, and that also is where the zooplankton are. So the zooplankton are floating around on the surface, hammering all the phytoplankton. Interestingly, though, what happens when the phytoplankton densities start to drop, they have this interesting response. They drop down in the water column. So they go deeper. All the zooplankton are still at the surface, and the phytoplankton drop down. And the phytoplankton population then recovers. And after the population is recovered, it comes back up to the surface. In other words, the phytoplankton have a refugium that they exploit at low densities. And that causes this prey isocline to do that. And it's because the prey isocline goes way the heck up with these low densities, that indicates the refugium, that the system remains stable. Why is that important? Well, it's important because the number of different animals that are feeding on zooplankton and phytoplankton, in particular things like whales. Okay, so where you have these top predators like whales, which are relying on these sorts of food resources. All right. That's just sort of a cleanup on predation. Before we move on, my little button. So there you have a system where you have phytoplankton and zooplankton at the bottom. It's a system that looks something like this. These are referred to as food webs or food chains, right? So here you have the phytoplankton, the primary producer at the bottom. Here you have the zooplankton, and then above that you have the fish that feed on the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, and the whales and all of that sort of stuff. So it's a very linear sort of food chain. That is perhaps not ideal. Why is it not ideal? Because what happens if the phytoplankton go extinct? If the phytoplankton go extinct, that's it for the animals that feed on the phytoplankton, namely the zooplankton, and the animals that feed on the zooplankton, all of those things go extinct as well. So the problem with these very linear sorts of food webs or food chains is that they are not particularly stable. And that's one of the things that we care about. We care about stability of the system. On the other hand, a system that looks like this is pretty stable. Because if that species goes extinct, this animal right here still has that food resource. And this animal up here still has those two food resources. It turns out the more connections there are in a food web, the more stable it is. So connectivity in a food web promotes stability. That's what we care about. Okay? This kind of a food system right here is pretty unstable. Okay? This one isn't particularly stable. None of these are particularly stable. As you go from A through C, stability increases. Okay? Increased connectivity results in increased stability of the food web. Great, so what? Who cares? Well, you should care, because when you look out at the natural world and we think about extinction of species, every time a species goes extinct, one of these links in a food web somewhere has dropped out of the system. So the stability of the system has gone down. We are in the midst of a mass extinction event. Right? We've had a couple of mass extinction events already. At the end of the Permian, there was a mass extinction event in which 95% of all species went extinct. At the end of the Cretaceous, there was a mass extinction event in which about half of all species went extinct. We are now in the midst of the mass extinction event at the Anthropocene, right? And already the number of species extinction is huge. Roughly half of all marsupials have already gone extinct. Okay, that's huge. You look at the number of, I mean, we can't even count the number of insects that have already gone extinct. You probably know that honeybees are in serious danger. And if honeybees go extinct, what does that mean for agriculture? That's bad news for agriculture, okay, which is bad news for us. The number of extinctions is accelerating at a phenomenal pace. By the time you're my age, there are a lot of things that won't be here anymore, right? Rhinos will probably not be here. A lot of big cats won't be here anymore, right? Siberian tigers are unlikely to be here. A lot of fish species are no longer going to be here. I mean, the number of extinctions that have occurred in your lifetime is heartbreaking. The reason it's important is because each extinction reduces the stability of the food web. And the question is, how long can the food web retain its integrity and we still have a viable system? Okay, so that's why that is important. Let's now look at a couple of gradients of species diversity. So I want to talk a little bit about species diversity now, and I want to talk about some of the things that influence species diversity. So we know that competition and predation influence species diversity. We've talked about the fact that, you know, the stability of the system is a function of the functional response, the type 3 functional response. But let's now, just for a few moments, look at some basic patterns of species diversity. So let's look at latitude, where this is closer to the equator and this is closer to the pole. And let's look at what happens to the number of mammal species. As you go towards the equator, the number of mammal species is pretty high. And as you move towards the pole, the number of mammal species gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Why is that? Well, let's think of what mammals are close to the Arctic Circle. So as a reference point, we'll use Fairbanks, Alaska. Imagine you live, has anybody here ever been up to Fairbanks? If you've never been to Fairbanks, you should go. It's off. Go in the summer, don't go in the winter. Just for the experience. And if you make it, make the extra effort and get up to the Arctic Circle. It's really cool when you drive from Anchorage and you drive up to Fairbanks. It is absolutely amazing. You're driving along, and at first you see all these huge pine trees in Anchorage, and as you're getting farther and farther north, the trees are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and farther and farther and farther between, until right before you get to Anchorage, all the trees are about this tall. Okay, and you're out on the tundra and you're just coming over this little rise and you have these little tiny ass trees. Then you go down in elevation a little bit, closer to Fairbanks, and the trees get taller again. But out on the taiga, it's just stunning how severe the environment is and how slow growing. A tree that's this tall might be 400 years old. And that's all the photosynthesis it's been able to accomplish in 400 years is to get it up to that particular size. That's all. So as you go north, productivity goes way down. What else is happening? The environmental conditions are becoming much more severe, which means suddenly you've exceeded the tolerance limits of most species. Most species can't handle the extreme cold or the extreme long winters without light, or the depth of the snow or the ice or whatever it happens to be. Most species can't handle it, and as a consequence you end up with relatively few species. The species that are there overall are fundamentally different than the species that are up here. Species close to the tropics are what? What's the most abundant species around the equator of mammals? What would you imagine it would be? Bats. More bats than anything else. The place is just thick with bats. And bats are little tiny guys. Okay? Most bats weigh under 10 grams. They're just these little tiny things. And they're out there feeding on insects. And there are a gazillion species of them. We haven't even counted all of them yet. What are the bears like in the tropics? There are none. Okay? Well, there used to be. Okay? But they were relatively... when you guys go to the zoo, next time you go to the zoo, the St. Louis Zoo, check out the Malayan sun bear. How big are Malayan sun bears? They're like a giant pit bull, okay? It's not a particular, they're plumb fuck nuts, right? They're crazy, they're neurotic, they're wacko, but they're not very big. They turn out to be really aggressive and really hard to handle and deal with and very dangerous, but they're not very big. So that is a tropical, subtropical bear. What's our bear right here in Missouri? Black bear, which is this big, but it's not that big. You ever see a black bear next to a grizzly, and it's holy smokes, the grizzly bear is monstrous compared to the black bear. And then you compare a polar bear to a grizzly, the polar bear is absolutely huge. As you go north, the average size of mammals goes up. Mammals get bigger as you go closer towards the poles, either the North Pole or the South Pole. Why is that? Well, it's pretty basic. It's surface area to volume ratio. The bigger you are, the lower your surface area to volume ratio, which means the less heat exchange you have with the environment. The bigger you are, the fewer calories you need on a per gram basis to keep you going. You know that. Maybe at some point in your life you were a lot heavier than you are now. If so, you know how difficult it is to lose weight. Why? Because when you're heavy, when you're really big, the number of calories you need on a per gram basis is small. Maybe you remember your days in high school or junior high when you were a skinny mini and you were desperately trying to put on a little bit of weight, how hard that was. It was hard because your surface area to volume ratio was so high, and the number of calories you needed on a per gram basis was high as well. So if you have a friend that is morbidly obese, right, you have to keep in mind how difficult it is to lose that mass. So let's look at patterns of mammal diversity in North America. So these are isoclines of diversity, and let's look at where the numbers are lowest and highest. We'll look up here in northern Alaska across, the northern Canada, 20 species of mammals above this point. Okay. Up here we got 30 species, 40 species, 50, 60, 70, 80. 90, 100, 110. Go down here into Central America, right, 150 species of mammals and so on. 70 species. What's right here? What the hell is that right there?
The Great Lakes.
The where?
The Great Lakes.
No, Great Lakes are up here. There's Florida. What is that? Let's go from the left coast to the right coast. Okay? The left coast is the right coast, but the right coast is not. You don't get it, never mind. So there's California. What's the first thing you hit coming off the beach in California? You end up in the coastal range. And what comes after the coastal range? The Sierra Nevadas. Okay? So the Sierra Nevada mountains. And then you come into the Great Basin. And what happens after you come out of the Great Basin? You're up in the Rocky Mountains. Then you drop down into the Midwest, the sad Midwest. The boring, the flat, the humid, the bug-ridden, the nasty Midwest. And then you come out to this glorious place right here. What is that?
The Smoky Mountains.
Yeah, the Appalachians. Okay? So that's the Appalachians right there. Hey, guess what? Mountains means more species. I wonder why. What?
Habitats.
Pardon? Yeah, because in a very short distance, you can have high elevations and low elevations, and all kinds of different plant species, and all kinds of rocky crevices, and there's a lot of structural diversity and plant diversity, right? So the diversity of mammals goes up dramatically. So mountains are associated with higher mammal diversity. And as you go into the tropics, the diversity increases as well. Why? Well, probably because in the tropics, what's different about the climate? Okay, if you lived in Idaho Falls, what would your day be like today? Here it is, November, right? And I notice people are wearing t-shirts and short sleeves. Some people have sweaters because they were optimistic that today would be a normal day. Okay. What would it be like if you were in Idaho Falls? It'd be cold. It'd be damn cold. It'd be well below freezing outside, so you'd be all bundled up in your parka and your gloves and your mittens and your, you know, all that sort of stuff. It's pretty easy peasy to be out here, okay? We don't have those climatic extremes. We have mild winters and we have hot, nasty summers, but it's unpredictable. This year, it's warm and balmy. Some years at this time, we've already got snow on the ground out there. It's unpredictable. Down here, it's really predictable. Why is it so predictable right here? What's different about here and here? What's different about there and there? In terms of the weather, in terms of temperature, and in terms of rainfall. What's different? Start with rainfall.
Closer to the equator, so you have more rainfall.
The closer you are to the, right? We talked about those cycles, right? Those cells. There's more rainfall, there's more productivity, there's more plant growth, which means there's more food, which means there's more food for all the animals to eat. Okay? Which means you can have more species. What's different? So there we are in Missouri, and there we are in California, straight shot from Missouri to California. We could go up there, get on I-70, or go down to Interstate 40, go straight across the Interstate 40, straight. We won't get to the coast, but we'll have to make a little turn, get on a different freeway, but end up right there on the beach. What's the weather like standing on the beach compared to standing in the parking lot in front of McGill Hall? How's the weather going to be different? How many of you have ever been to California, to the coast? One person. What's it like?
It's nice.
Nice.
Yeah.
All the babes running around in their bikinis and stuff. It's great. I used to go to school right on the beach. The college I was going to was right there on the beach, just a couple blocks away. Sit at student bookstore, student cafe, sit there drinking my coffee, watching the girls walk by in their bikinis going from one class to the next. It was glorious. It was great. It's wonderful, loved it. That's why I kept going to school, because where else could you do that? Get a job in a factory, you don't get those sorts of views. It was awesome. What's the weather like? What's it like in the middle of winter in Los Angeles?
Just kind of mild, really.
Yeah, you're walking around in t-shirts and flip-flops and shorts. It's crazy, man. Why is it so nice? Same latitude, and it sucks here. Why is that?
The ocean to the temperatures.
Because the ocean is this huge body of water, and it's hard to change the temperature of the water, right? So it's like this giant insulating layer right there. So the temperature close to the coast doesn't change very much. The ocean moderates the temperature. And that's why you get all those species. And look down here, you're surrounded on both sides by ocean. It's hard to change the temperature right there. The temperature regimes are pretty darn stable because of the proximity of the water, which means you are within the tolerance limits of almost every species imaginable. Let's look at birds. Well, I'll be dipped. It's the same sort of pattern. As you go south, the number of birds increases. It gets crazy high as you go down here. So the same pattern is shown by birds as by mammals. And the thing about birds is they are more mobile. So they can leave when things get bad, right? That's why instead of having 10 species of mammals up here, you've got 40 species of birds, because they can leave when things get really rough. But it's the same basic pattern of diversity. We're going to come back and figure out how to measure diversity. But what I want to do now, I'm going to skip probably almost all of that stuff, which is good news for you. But let's think a little bit about a couple of natural experiments that have taken place. And one of those was this volcanic eruption on Krakatoa in 1883. Another good example would be Mount St. Helens back in 1980. You guys weren't born in 1980, but it was a pretty dramatic event. I can remember watching it on television, and just the thought going through my mind was, holy effing smokes, okay? Just good Lord, I mean, this was a phenomenal event, and it wasn't unexpected. People knew that it was going to happen. So these huge efforts to evacuate the mountain, right, get people off the mountain. Now remember, there was one old guy who had a cabin up on the mountain and refused to leave. And he says, no, I've been doing this my whole life, it's fine. You know, I'm staying. Let it blow, I don't care. And of course, he was incinerated, but, well, we're assuming he was incinerated. There's no trace of anything up there anymore. I mean, the whole top of the mountain just got blown off. So Krakatoa is this island, and there's this volcanic eruption. The entire island is denuded. There's nothing on there. Unfortunately, back in 1883, after the eruption, people go back visiting the island. We didn't have the understanding of biology that we have now. So unfortunately, there was a lot of contamination of the island once we started revisiting. If that were to happen today, it would be really cool, because then nobody goes on the island except they're in a, full protective gear so that we don't introduce any bacteria or any microbes or anything else to the island. But the cool thing is, you can look at what happened to the diversity of species on the island after the eruption, and it follows this really interesting pattern. So diversity increases and increases and increases until it reaches some equilibrium point and then stabilizes. So since 1883, Krakatoa has returned to a pretty normal level of species diversity. The same is true on Mount St. Helens. After the eruption, the mountaintop was denuded, and of course you go there now and it looks fundamentally different, right? There are all sorts of species there now that were not there before. So the point is, when you have suddenly the creation of a new island, what we care about is how species are able to colonize those islands. And there are a couple of patterns that I want to draw your attention to. Okay? If S is the number of species, then we can look, and A is area, then you can look at this relationship between number of species and area and draw this nice, oh, wait a minute. Is that a line? Is that the equation of a line? What is that the equation of. If S is number of species and A is area, C is going to be a constant. What happens if you take the log of both sides of that? What's the log of C times A raised to the Z power? You guys don't remember your logarithms from high school? You learned it just for the damn test and said, I'll never need that shit again. Purge the old memory banks so that you can put more important stuff in there. I understand, I appreciate that. It's good to keep a nice, well-organized mind ready for new information. It turns out if you take, what's the log of a product? What's the log of A times B? It's the log of A plus the log of B, okay? What's the log of A raised to the Z power? It's Z times the log of A, okay? So, hey, you take the log of both sides and you, no shit, buckwheat, you get a line, okay? So instead of having something that is sort of exponential, you now get this nice linear kind of response. The important point for us is that there is a relationship between number of species and area. Why would that be? Why is there a relationship between number of species and area? Yeah.
Because there can only be so many species in one area.
Let's imagine we want to populate an island with new species. We want to put up, it's an island which is as big as the CMO campus, but the CMO campus doesn't have any buildings on it. So it's just the North Campus here. That's all the area that's there. Could we support a population of mice? You bet. Could we support a population of cockroaches? Easily. Flies, bees, cardinals, sure. We could support all kinds of species of grasses and trees and so on. Could we support a population of people on an area just as big as, okay, well, we might be able to support 2 people, and those 2 people have some kids. They start a family and they start making more kids and more. How many people could we support on an area this size? Not a lot. How many acres do you need to support one person? How many acres of land? Let's imagine you're sick of this world. All you want is your own little piece of property up in the mountains somewhere and enough acres in your cabin so that you can make it on your own. How many acres do you need? Gonna have to have a garden? How many acres? What do you think? Guess. 5?
20.
20? 30?
30.
30? 20? It's 5. You only need 5. Okay, I mean, you're going to work hard on 5 acres, and you're going to depend on a little bit of hunting and so on, but 5 acres of garden is a lot of food. All right? So that's good for you and your partner. Now you start adding bambinos to the mix or something, and suddenly you're going to need more. Let's imagine that on the CMO campus you can support a population of 6 people. 3 couples. Are you going to be able to sustain a population on 3 couples? What happens if COVID-19 hits that population of 6 people? Whoops, it's wiped out. What happens if some other weird disease hits that population? What happens if one person dies in a horrible chainsaw accident? What happens you know, I mean, all the different things that could happen, it seems unlikely to me that you could maintain the population on only a small handful of people. You're going to need more than this land size. In other words, the more area you have, the more different kinds of species you can fit in there. The smaller the area, the smaller the populations are. The smaller the populations are, the more susceptible they are to extinction events. Let's look at area in square miles and look at number of species. And these are amphibian and reptile species in the Antilles. Do you guys know where the Antilles are? They're the Greater Antilles and the Lesser Antilles. Where are they? Okay, so you know, you have a map in your head, you know where the United States is, and you know where Mexico and Central America, and then right below that is South America. And if you were to go south from Florida and head straight south and slightly west, what country would you run into? Venezuela. Okay? So you'd run into Venezuela, and you come across the north shore of Venezuela. There are these little island chains, little dots of islands that come all the way across the north and make this nice big loop coming all the way up to Jamaica and Cuba. Okay? And that island chain, that's the Antilles. Geologically, where does that island chain come from? What's to the west of that island chain? The Gulf of Mexico. Okay? What created the Gulf of Mexico? In terms of storytelling, what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, which is false. What's the story you learned in grade school about what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs?
Asteroid impact.
What?
Asteroid impact.
Yeah, giant meteor impacts the surface of the Earth. Where did it land? In the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? That's where it landed. That's why you have that nice big basin there. Okay? That's where it landed. So the idea is that all those islands are, quote unquote, the rubble and the ground layer that gets pushed up after the meteor impact. Okay? All right. So now there's this chain of islands. Some of these islands are really tiny, 1 square mile, and notice what happens as the island area gets bigger. The number of species on the island of amphibians and reptiles gets bigger too. And it's a line, but notice the scale over here. What kind of scale is this? 1, 10, 100? What's that scale? $10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100. What's that scale? It's logarithmic. In other words, this is S equals C times A raised to the Z power. Only they took the log of both sides, so now you have log number of species and log area. So that is that nice curve, but here it's shown linearized because it's on a log-log scale. The important point is, number of species increases with area. Why? Let's look at other examples. Let's look at flowering plants in England. And let's go ahead and look at some different forest patches and so on. Let's look at area in square miles and number of plant species, and all the different shit. It's the same pattern. Okay? number of species increases with area. Let's look at insects of British trees. Okay? So this is the range of the host tree species, and this is the associated insect species. All be dipped. It's a linear relationship. As the number of available tree species increases, the number of insects increases as well. Let's look at North American birds. Area on the x-axis, number of species on the y-axis. All be dipped. Follows the same kind of pattern. In other words, species diversity depends on area. So let's look now at a map of the Great Basin. Okay? There are the Sierras. Okay? There's the Great. Has anybody here ever been through the Great Basin? Anyone ever been to Reno, Nevada? You leave Reno, Nevada, and you cut across. All of this is sagebrush, okay, and rabbit brush and cheatgrass, and so you just start driving across. And all of a sudden, there are all these mountains. Not gigantic mountains like the Sierras or the Rockies, but there are these mountains. They're all covered with ponderosa pine and pinyon juniper and that sort of stuff. You can drive up, what is that, 395 or whatever it is that goes up like that. If you look at all of those mountains, right, each one is like an island, and they're actually referred to as sky islands. Because this is all sagebrush habitat right here. Now you get up onto that thing, and it's ponderosa pine. Think about it from a mouse's point of view. There you are, you're this little mouse, and you're living amongst the pine trees. The reason you live amongst the pine trees is because that's where all the resources are that you need. And you can't make it in the sagebrush, because you don't know what to eat. There's nothing for you to eat in the sagebrush. So you're dependent on the pine. Or imagine you're a bird species which is dependent on the pine trees. Or let's talk about red squirrels. Red squirrels are these, not fox squirrels, but it's Tamia sciurus. One of those sorts of things that just feeds on certain kind of buds off pine trees. It'll eat pine cones and things like that. There's nothing for the red squirrel to eat out here. So each of these things is like an island. So the species that are obligate for species are trapped on those islands. Now if you're a bird, you can fly from one to the next. But if you're a mammal, or a lizard, or a snake, or a frog, you can't. You're stuck there. There's a toad out west referred to as the Boreal Toad. And it's a species of conservation concern because it depends on these high elevation sort of sky island habitats. And because of the way we treat those habitats, it's, the logging activities and whatnot, that species is on the verge of extinction. But you can think about these things as islands. If you were to go to these things and say, okay, let's measure the area of each of these islands and do that same sort of graph, number of species against area, you would find exactly the same pattern that we had before. Now, let's think about it like this. So here's the Great Basin. What was the climate in the Great Basin like 30 million years ago? Was it like it is today? No. Because at some point, this would have been forested. It would have been fundamentally different. But as the climate changed, the pine trees moved up in elevation and got trapped on tops of these mountains, and the sagebrush introduced and came in from down below. So some of those species have been trapped on mountaintops forever. But some species got there by a process called rafting, sweepstakes rafting. You can raft not just on water, but you can raft on wind currents, and you can raft on the back of a semi, you can raft in all sorts of different ways. But they get there by other means. So the question is, how do you get to those islands? If you create a new island, how does that island become populated? Let's look at this scenario. So this is the Southern California coast from San Diego, the cancer that is Los Angeles, all the way up to Santa Barbara. And let's look at the coastal islands. San Clemente, the Western White House of Richard Milhouse Nixon, right? Is the Western White House. He didn't have Mar-a-Lago, he had his little house there in San Clemente, California, looking out onto San Clemente Island. Santa Catalina, okay, there's Torrance right there. Santa Barbara, San Nicolas, Santa Rosa, San Miguel, Santa Cruz, Anacapa Island. So all these islands, they are coastal islands, they're not oceanic islands, they are coastal islands. Let's think about some of the species that are on those islands. On Santa Catalina Island, there is a population of bison. There was also a population of feral hogs. We used to have a faculty member here. He was here for just 1 year, Blake McCann. And he was the god of feral hogs. We were really fortunate to have him for the year that he was here. He left when he realized that somebody who had been hired at the same time as him was making $5,000 a year more. And he was certain that that was a clerical error, so he went and approached the dean and said, there seems to be an error here because this person's making $5,000 a year more than I am. And we both started at the same time. And the dean said, no, that's not a mistake. And so Blake says, well, you have to fix my pay. And the dean said, no. And Blake said, all right, I quit. I'll be gone at the end of the semester. And he did. He left. That was really sad. It was really unfortunate because he was probably worth $30,000 more than the person that was getting more than he was. Blake McCann is the person who removed the feral hogs from Santa Catalina Island. He killed each and every damn last one. Okay? He's also the guy that in Pinnacles National Monument in California killed the last feral hog. And they fenced the whole monument in to keep any new hogs from getting in. He came here and he was working on feral hogs at Mingo. And he was going to kill every goddamn last feral hog at Mingo. Okay? And he left.
How did you do it? Just out of curiosity.
Well, it's trapping. There's no way you're going to remove feral hogs by opportunistic shooting.
So is he the one that introduced it to the conservation, the trapping idea?
Yeah, well, that whole notion of trapping has been going on for some. What's changed dramatically is the kind of traps that get used. The traps that were used early on were these things called rooter gate traps. So it's a trap, and you bait it, and the pig comes along and bumps up against the gate and just pushes it open and walks in and then can't get back out. And when they realize they can't get back out, they're squealing and they're upset, and none of the other pigs say, I'm not going in there, man. So you get only a handful of pigs at a time. And then they started using these drop gate traps. So the pigs would go in and they're operated by camera, so you can sit there and look at your phone. You can see when the pigs are in there, and as soon as you've got the whole sounder, you can get you hit the little button, send a text message to the camera, and the gate drops and you've got your pigs, and then you just go in and shoot them. But pigs are strictly two-dimensional animals. They're not paying attention to what's above them. So what they're using now are these traps, which the entire trap is suspended above, and it's on this sort of rotating thing. So you get the camera feed and all the traps, or all the pigs are in there feeding on the corn that you put out. So yeah, I got them all. You just send a little text message and the thing just spins down and traps them. And they go nuts. You know, and then you go in and then you shoot them. So that's a, Blake McCann had this scar on his forearm. It went all the way up like that. And he was over in southern Illinois, I think, and he had killed this pig. It was a boar. And he was over there, and just to make sure the thing was dead, he was going to cut the throat on it, because these pigs are hard to kill. They have a lot of sinuses, air sinuses on the top of the skull, so you shoot them through the hell and through the skull. You put the bullet in the air sinus, but you've not penetrated the brain. That animal is stunned and it's laying there, and you think it's dead, but it's not. And he went down and he was going to cut the throat on the guy. And you know, they have these curved tusks, and this guy just pulled his head up like that and caught Blake right there and just opened him up all the way, you know, to the cubital. And he was just bleeding like crazy. And, you know, he survived, you know, but he has this incredible, awesome scar going up. It's great. All right. Feral hogs are difficult. And in connection to what we're doing, why are feral hogs bad? Because as feral hog population increases, the population size of wild turkeys goes down, and the population size of deer just drops through the floor. So the pigs are so good at exploiting all the food and changing the habitat and causing reductions in populations of everything else, that it's really disconcerting. How much time do I have?
It's 10:18.
Oh, okay. We've got a little time. All right, so San Nicolas Island. I think it's both San Nicolas and San Miguel. The U.S. Navy uses those for target practice. So they've introduced a population of goats on those islands. And then the Navy goes in with their destroyers and they use them for target practice, and they test out new artillery shells and whatnot. And the reason they're using goats is so that they can better assess, because goats are roughly the same physical size as a human, so they can better assess the damage that they would inflict on a human population. So they use them as target practice to assess, you know, damage to life on those, which I think is sort of bizarre, but there it is. Think about those islands. What's on those? Birds, snakes, and island foxes. How did the foxes get there? The island foxes are in the genus Urocyon, which is the same genus of the gray fox that we have here in Missouri. The gray fox is Urocyon cinerio argenteus, and this is Urocyon littoralis. It's in the littoral zone. Okay? So the gray foxes, the island foxes, are a daughter species of our gray fox. How the hell did they get there? How the heck did they get to those islands? Now, it's not like the Galapagos. We talked about marine iguanas already. You look at the Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador, but the Galapagos Islands are oceanic islands. So you would have had green iguanas basking on the beach, doing push-ups, trying to, you know, show off to the other iguanas. They climb up on a log on a piece of driftwood. The tide comes in, washes them out, and the current takes them straight out to the Galapagos. And because they're reptiles, they don't have to eat every day. They can eat once a week, once every other week, something like that. They'll survive. They get to the Galapagos. They've now populated the Galapagos. A natural selection then caused changes in the species so that they could specialize on algae, and we now call them marine iguanas rather than green iguanas. But how did the foxes get there? Because they're not going to climb up on a piece of driftwood and float for 3 weeks. They'll starve to death. Okay? How did they get there? Because those island foxes are on each and every one of those islands, of those channel islands. Interesting thing, the reason gray foxes are so cool is because they climb trees. And they do it really well. Most of these islands don't have trees on them. And the other interesting thing about island foxes is they're smaller than our gray foxes. So through natural selection, they're smaller. How do they get to those islands? And it turns out, this is kind of cool, they've been isolated long enough so that genetically they are distinct. The genetic differences aren't big enough yet to call them different species, but each island has its own subspecies of island fox. Well, I'll tell you this, the ocean there is never frozen over, okay? The water gets cold in the winter. By cold, I mean it gets down to about 52 degrees in the winter, but it doesn't get anywhere close enough cold to freeze. So they didn't walk over. They didn't fly over. It's unlikely that they swam over.
The islands were connected to the west coast.
The sea level was probably never low enough so that they could walk over. Not in the time that they've been there. Which means, yeah, go ahead. Well, that's a good question, but that would imply then that humans were here long before 20,000 years ago, which seems unlikely. And now, I think most anthropologists would agree that the North American Indians got here somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,500 years ago, and they've probably been there much longer than 17,000 years. Yeah, it's a good question. We don't really, I mean, it's possible. But let's think about if you were going to get on, which island would you get onto first? Which island was the one that was probably populated first? There are two things that are going to matter. What are the two things that are going to matter? Think about it. How many of you people shoot, either target shooting or archery? Anybody? So, you're going to practice your archery skills. You're going to stand back at 100 yards and let her fly? No.
Not usually.
No. When you first learn, how far away are you from the target?
10, 20 yards.
Yeah, you're pretty close, right? You're nice and close, right? And how good are you at getting close to the target? Not very at first, okay? So but if the target is really big, it's easier to hit. The bigger the target, the more likely you are to hit the target. The closer you are to the target, the more likely you are to hit it. The farther away you are, the harder it is to hit. The smaller the target, the harder it is to hit. So if you're a hunter, what's the longest shot you've ever been able to make? Either hunting or target shooting.
With a bow?
No, with a rifle.
Oh, with a rifle. I usually have a lot of wood, so I usually don't shoot over like 100, 200 yards.
Yeah, but 200 yards is already, okay, that's...
Yeah, that's a pretty far shot for...
That's a pretty far shot, okay? You know anybody that can do 400 yards?
Not really, but I'm sure there's people out there.
There are people out there that can do over a mile, okay? They're not doing it with just, your off the Walmart shelf rifle, okay? So they've got the scope and they're paying attention to the wind, and they're paying attention to the temperature, and they know exactly what the load is and all that sort of stuff, and they've got it all dialed in. They've got the best scope money can buy, and they know how to breathe, right? All that sort of stuff. And they'll nail a 2-inch circle at a mile. Okay? On a moving target, they'll be able to lead it, they'll figure out how fast that target is going, and they'll drop it at a mile. Pretty good. Pretty damn hard to do. Point is, the farther away you are, and the smaller the target, the harder it is to hit. Now think about that from the perspective of getting to these islands as a species. The closer the island is, the easier it is to hit from the mainland. The bigger it is, the easier it is to hit. The farther away it is, the smaller it is, the harder it is to hit. Wouldn't it be cool to be able to get tissue samples from those island foxes and look at how much mutational change has happened between them and the gray foxes? And if you know that mutations happen at a certain rate, you could then estimate exactly when each island was populated by the gray foxes. That would be an awesome research project. You could get here to Anacapa and then make it from there to Santa Cruz, and from Santa Cruz to Santa Rosa, and from Santa Rosa to San Miguel, because that's a pretty short hop. Getting to Santa Catalina, how far is it from there, from Torrance to Santa Catalina? 26 miles. You guys don't know that song. Your grandparents know that song. 26 miles across the sea, Santa Catalina is that whole thing. Yeah. Okay, it's 26 miles. Getting to there is going to be a hell of a lot harder. Getting to there is going to be a hell of a lot harder. So you can imagine that the foxes got there, perhaps by sweepstakes rafting. It turns out, if you've ever been on the Southern California coast, one of the things that oftentimes washes up on the coast are these gigantic trees. So you'll have these cliffs up in Northern California where the cliff collapses. These giant pine trees will fall into the ocean, right? And they'll just float. And every now and then they wash up on the beach, and then the tide comes in and washes them out. And it's entirely possible that that happens right here. And there's this fox that comes up and is sleeping on that tree as it's laying there on the beach, and the tide comes in, and suddenly he's washing out, and he hits Santa Catalina. Because the tide, the current, is going southwards like that during part of the year, and is going northwards during part of the year. All right? So distance from the mainland and size of the island is going to influence. We can do the same sort of things with these islands off the coast of Panama. It's the same principle. But here's what we want to pay attention to. This axis down here is number of species, and this axis up here is the rate. And there are two rates that we're looking at. We're looking at the rate of immigration onto the island, and we're looking at the rate of extinction from the island. Okay, let's concentrate on immigration to the island. Your rate of immigration to the island is going to be a function of whether you are near or far. The closer you are to the source, the closer you are to the mainland, the higher your rate of immigration to the island. It's a bigger target. It's easier to get to. Okay? So if you're close, the rate of immigration is going to be high. As you get farther and farther and farther away, the rate of immigration gets lower. Now let's look at the probability of extinction. If the island is really tall, you're going to be highly susceptible to crashes in the populations, diseases, temporary loss of food, all those sorts of things. As the island gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the probability of extinction goes higher. So here, on a small island, the probability of extinction is much higher than on a big island. So island size influences the probability of extinction. Big islands have a low probability of extinction. Small islands have a small probability of extinction. Small islands have a high probability of extinction. So now you ask the question, what is the equilibrium number of species on the island? That's simply going to be where the rate of immigration intersects the rate of extinction. So on a near small island, the equilibrium number of species is where those two lines intersect. It's that number of species. But on a near island that's big, it's that many species. So a near island that is big will have more species than a near island that is small. Similarly, an island that's far away and small will have few species. An island that is far away but big will have more species. So that's the graph that was developed by Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. You guys probably know we've talked about Robert MacArthur before when we talked about competition and the models for competition. And you probably know who E.O. Wilson is. If you've ever had a course with Tim Judd, you know all about E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson is this entomologist from Harvard, specializes on ants and things of that sort, and is also the author of a book called Sociobiology. So he was the author of that very controversial book. It's an awesome book. If you don't have it, you should try and get a copy of it. They're hard to come by, but it's an awesome book. At any rate, E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur developed this idea of island biogeography, and they wrote this book entitled Island Biogeography. And this is the conclusion, the basic primary principle that comes out of that book. And that is the relationship between island size and island distance from the source. And you can then figure out exactly what the equilibrium number of species should be. And that applies not just to oceanic islands, like you see in the Channel Islands of California, or across the Antilles, right? Or across that archipelago off the coast of Panama. It also applies to those sky islands in the Great Basin. So if you're interested in squirrels, or you're interested in mice, you're interested in some weird little insect or some weird little group of flowers or something like that, the sky islands in the Great Basin would be a phenomenal place to work, where you can investigate those patterns of island biogeography. All right, now I'm going to stop there today. The key point from all of this is this particular graph right here. Okay, there will be questions on the exam. We will probably review how to do the review. After we go online, there will be we have 2 more lectures, right? I wonder, do people have, do you guys have laptops that have video, little video camera on your laptop or something? I mean, it might be possible to do a review session via Zoom or something like that, just so that we can go through all of this stuff one more time before the exam. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work. I'm probably not going to be here as soon as we go to online. I think I'm probably going to go up to the mountains and finish this semester in a place that's glorious rather than down here. But they tell me they have internet up at 6,000 feet, so we'll see. All right, I'll see you guys in lab, I guess.
Will lab be in the classroom this week or outside?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. We need we need to get your experiment stuff up and running. Right, I think, how far along are you on organization of your optimal foraging stuff? We need to just get the sand distributed. Right, so that'll have to happen in class. You have an experiment set up, ready to go?
They just don't have our understanding of everything.
Yeah, so it's, all we're going to do is finalize the final details for getting your experimental stuff up and running. Speaking of that, for those of you that don't yet have a location, the river campus, you guys know the little park there between the river and the old seminary building. There's that old beech tree, and there's some benches there, and there's a little pavilion. That area right there, I was there on Saturday with my dog, and I counted, I think, 35 squirrels. So it's thick with squirrels, and that would be an easy place to spend, you know, some hours just putting out your feeding trays and watching these guys. I think it would be easy to do. A comfortable, pleasant, visually appealing location. So if you're looking for a place, that's one possibility. So to answer your question, all we're going to do in lab is get your experiments up and running. Okay. All right.